Good evening, everybody, to another episode of Kiron Talks. Again, we're together with Dominic Orr, Sabrina Konzok, and a special guest. Our evening today, our conversation today will be about a special topic with Vivian Rath, who is a researcher and lecturer at Trinity College in Dublin. His topic is learning and disability and or disability in society, and we will learn about this in a moment. I just want to say that this series is an idea of Dominic Orr and Sabrina Konzok, both working for Kiron Higher Education, among others. And Sabrina also is engaged in Send, a network in Germany for social entrepreneurs. My name is Tino Brömme, and our special guest is Vivian from Dublin, and the disabled people. And I think it would be very nice, Vivian, if you could tell us, give us a bit of context, how what situation a disabled person is in today. I mean, I think you will speak from the UK, right?
Thank you very much, Tino, for that lovely introduction.
From the UK, from Ireland.
Yes, of course. That was the very first thing. All of my Irish friends wouldn't be very pleased if they heard that.
Damn it!
And I would have had to start with a history lesson.
That's true.
Mix up.
Thank you very much. So as you said, my name is Vivian Rath, and I am a PhD researcher and lecturer in Trinity College Dublin, Ireland. And that so my area of research is the social engagement experiences of disabled students in higher education in Ireland. And the thing about that is that whereas there has been a huge focus in the last 10, 15 years in Ireland on actually getting disabled students into college and then supporting their academic needs, there has been little or no focus on their wider social engagement and their more holistic experience in terms of research. And I mean, those policies to get students into college have worked, and we've seen great success in terms of the number of disabled students attending higher education in Ireland has increased dramatically. I think when I attended college in the early 2000s, it was less than 1%, whereas it's up to 7% now. So it's a much better representation within our institutions. However, now is the time to start to focus even more on their social engagement skills within the higher education institution. And just maybe a little bit about my research. My research involved a large study of the students within higher education in Ireland, disabled students, and looked at issues in relation to their the sense of belonging, their engagement, social engagement experiences, and then of course the policy and practice within those institutions. I also interviewed senior management in relation to disabled students, which was something that hadn't been done before either. That the idea was to get the whole picture, to look at the student in the center, and then to look at all of the aspects out from that area, to try and get a full picture of what the social engagement experiences of students were. So I'm delighted to say that I'm almost at submission time.
Wow.
I know, Dominic, yeah. so I'm submitting now in 10 weeks, and so I mean, obviously I've got some findings which will be very interesting, but there are four kind of major themes, and they relate to obviously their social engagement experiences, the system, the structures within the institution, and of course the wider environment as well, because when I looked at the policy, it was very clear to see that. And then of course, one very important aspect was the climate within that institution and in the wider environment. And so I think, have I put engagement, climate, systems, and of course, transitions and those transitions. And of course, there's a major focus in Ireland on transitions and how students are and what pathways they are transitioning to college. Because like in line with European policy in Ireland, there is a focus on that the lifelong learning. And of course, we'll discuss this later, but in terms of students with disabilities, most people who have a disability actually acquire it during their lifetime. This, in terms of, it may be very possible that people who are engaging in lifelong learning may actually have a disability at some point. And so that is very important. I think a lot of lifelong learners engage in online learning as well. So anyhow, I'm diverting a little bit. But anyhow, my research is due for submission now at the end of August. And there are 4 main themes, and really its main contribution will be the fact that it's opening up the discussion on the social engagement of disabled students in higher education in Ireland.
Thanks very much. I mean, I think all of that is very interesting. And, one reason I think we would like to talk to you about all of this is because there are many topics that are relevant for basically all students anyway. Social engagement is a huge issue. But maybe we could take one step back, because we talk about disabled students as if it were some kind of very clear one group, and they've got 1 or 2 characteristics which make them belong to this group. How can we understand disabled students as a group? How have you done it? Also, you in your own work, you have to represent this group.
Yeah, of course. Well, I mean, it can be very. Firstly, all disabled people are not the same.
Yeah.
And I think that's the key point here. All disabled are not the same. And then, of course, we have to remember that and I found this when I was doing my research, that students identify differently. So, for instance, a student maybe who engaged in the research actually didn't identify as themselves, as their first identity as disabled. So intersectionality now plays an ever-increasing role in higher education. And when you're dealing with students, you must bear this in mind, that you might identify a student, or your government or your institutional policy might identify as a student as in the category as disabled, and under that category there might be dyslexic or wheelchair user or mental health, or there could be any number of categories. But in actual fact, that student might actually identify as gay or lesbian, or a mature learner, or a parent, and that so we do have to remember that students now have multiple identities. In terms of the research, I would have used the definitions that we use here in Ireland. But the thing is that a lot of countries have very different definitions, and it often those definitions often depend on often the state at which and the culture and the society within that state. But now, of course, I would certainly refer to the UNCRPD definition, which is the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And I think if we're talking about definitions and things like that, personally, my view, it just comes down to the very simple thing of talk to the student, ask the student. And I think the independent living movement has a very, very good motto, which is nothing about us without us. So when it comes to decisions relating to disabled people, the best position to take is do not make decisions that relate to disabled people without let them being part of the decision-making process. So I think that's very critical. But can I just say as well, and I know we're talking about disability, and you just said, and I think you made a really good point, Dominic, and that's that in relation to defining disability and trying to identify disability. But the key point here is they're not, disabled people, including myself, are not a homogenous group. And the number two is to ask disabled people. But I think we need to go back another little step. Again, I've said earlier that disabled, most of the people who have a disability actually acquire it. A key number to remember, there's 1 in every 5, or just a little bit less than that, depending on what country you're in, have a disability. So that's a huge population of people. In Ireland, that's approximately 650,000 people in our population have disability. So I think that's a very important point to remember, but also that disabled people face a range of barriers. Now, at a societal level, the barriers they face include, for instance, lack of access to public transport, buildings that maybe have a stairs and no elevator, and steps at a door and no other accessible entrance. For visually impaired, for deaf people, there may not be sign language interpreting. So they're in. But if we take that, I mean, we might, in terms of the online environment, those barriers, when we think of online learning, most people say they oh, well, sure, it's accessible. It's online. That is the case.
Well, I think that's the point, isn't it? That firstly, there's these very disability, especially when we're thinking that under some definitions, it's 1 in 5 people have some kind of disability. Then it's per se, it's not a very useful category in a way, because it just means so many are. So one of the points is that often, and I'm always nervous when I see this one public sign for disabled people, which is somebody in a wheelchair, as if it was particularly the physical barriers, because then we could say, okay, so as you say, then okay, we make sure in public buildings we have lifts and everything's fine. And I think it's much more about, as you say, this focus, which is something that's always important for us at Kiron as well, is this focus on usability and the user experience. And I was reading just the other day that one of the biggest problems people have with visual impairment when it comes to online services is very often we have this capture on the website, which is trying to recognize, it always comes up and says, we want to check you're not a robot. And the thing is, this capture is visual. And then if you then take it to, you can normally get it that it reads words out, but that's very, very difficult for some people to use. So this is the kind of the user experience. I think in many cases online, we haven't been focusing on people with different types of impairment. I can speak of something super trivial. I'm colorblind. I'm not totally, I'm just like, red, green. But often with things, I just, like if they have buttons which are red or green, for me, that's just, I can't see the difference. And it's a totally trivial matter, but it's kind of, I think many people are much more, held back with this kind of online thing for much more serious matters. But that's just an example of these things are not being thought about enough.
So that's how you ended up in this show, Dominic.
Because I'm colorblind.
you pushed the wrong button. But, I have noticed in public websites that there are certain things to choose for better readability and so on. So maybe the approach could be, Vivian, what do you think? How far is the accessibility of online services, of online life, well done until now? What is your assessment of the situation in the online world for people with these or these other impairments?
Well, I think, Dominic, again, I mean, I just go back to your point. I mean, you mentioned about the colors and your color blindness. And, that's not a trivial matter to you if you're walking across the road and you reach a pedestrian crossing, and that there's a bus coming, and you think you don't know the difference between the red and green. That's not a trivial matter. So a very simple technology there is voiceover and voice technology at the with the beeper system, and that makes your life a lot safer and a lot easier. So I think we, and I think this is what disabled people do. Disabled people do exactly what you do, Dominic, all the time. They say, "Oh, it's only a trivial matter,"
right?
Because society has conditioned us. The society we live in has conditioned us to feel that our what we consider important isn't important. Why? Because disabled people are not involved in the decision making.
Yeah, totally. I mean, in the end, it's all about awareness, right? Because even the street sign challenge can be solved if you just write stop and go, right? I mean, obviously, there's other problems for people with other disabilities, but Dominic would be safer for sure. So,
Thanks, everyone.
And that's, of course, our biggest concern. No, but like coming back to the 4 sections you mentioned, right? Obviously, I guess they're all super important and super crucial. But if you would have to pick one that really makes the biggest difference, like what is it? Is it the engagement or the environment and the culture in a place, or what would you say? Or can you even pick? I know it's a tough one, but
personally, I don't think you can separate those items out because they're all interdependent. And that the if I mean if the culture and the climate is wrong, well then, for instance, you won't be able to engage. So, for instance, let's hypothetically say that the culture within your institution or the climate within your institution is one of a lack of awareness. Well, then how, then when you go to play, I don't know, if you want to go to a debate and the people who are organizing it are not aware of disability and they have it in a theater that is full of steps and no other way of access, well, then you won't be able to engage. So they're totally independent. I couldn't really, so for instance, if there is, let's take, for instance, okay, there's loads of awareness in that climate and that the student comes along to attend, but there are no structures in the institution to facilitate that student notifying, okay, I want to attend this event, but there are no mechanisms to let anybody know. And they turn up on the night and it's inaccessible. So I don't think it's possible to separate them out. And I think that really it's about taking a holistic approach and really bring, I mean, all of the research points to, especially in terms of management research, that it's about taking a multi-pronged approach in terms of embedding and managing inclusion, diversity and inclusion in institutions. And I think if we just bring it back maybe a little bit to online engagement, it's equally the same. It's equally the same, that we can't just separate each individual part, and say, okay, we're going to work on that and that'll make it accessible. That's not how it works. We must take a wider view. We must also bring in many voices. And then awareness is a part of that. And of course, I think that if, in terms of the engagement process, then if we can work in that way, I think we'd certainly be able to make very positive changes. I think it was mentioned, you mentioned there earlier in terms of accessibility. There are lots of web accessibility guidelines out there. The EU are working on them. There's many different sections of society working on them. And I think in most cases, I'm afraid to say that a lot of basic web accessibility guidelines are not being adhered to. And I mean, some of the very simple things, I use social media a lot. And in actual fact, disability rights campaigners, of course, as all campaigners do, as we've seen with Black Lives Matter, etc. But social media has actually opened up a whole world for many disabled people, especially disabled people who have been marginalized and isolated due to lack of transport, lack of personal assistance supports. So I'll give you just an example in terms of that. At the moment, I think there's a thing going on Twitter where you might put up a photo and you don't explain what that photo is about. My world in one photo, or my day in a photo, without any words. But that you're immediately isolating a whole group of the population who cannot see that photo, who cannot engage with it. Now, Twitter does offer it's alt text, isn't it? I think it's of that, which you can just simply add to it. Now, I think Twitter have since in the last week have made that compulsory on all photographs, so it just does it. But that has opened up a world to a whole range of people who perhaps couldn't. And in actual fact, it was disability rights campaigners campaigning under that and saying, listen here, look, can you please add the description of the photograph? That probably resulted in Twitter making that change. But it took a long time. I mean, these things take time. So, so it's interesting that something that was including everybody seemed to be inclusive, descriptive, opening up, and yet it was excluding other people.
Yeah, I think that is definitely helpful because, of course, we all know this kind of issue that you might put especially if you're designing something, you put a picture on and then you're immediately told to write something as the alternative. And then you just think, okay, that's going to take too much time. But I think one thing that's helped a lot now is a lot of the programs, for example, Google and perhaps and on Twitter as well, it tries, from recognizing the picture, it tries to write the text itself, basically through AI. And I think that is definitely helpful because, of course, most people using these services, they just want, the easiest way to do something. We use things like Instagram and stuff because it's just one press and you're done. And if someone says, okay, wait, but you now have to write this, this, and this to it, most people just try and avoid those things. So I'm quite hopeful there that technology can help us there at least.
Yeah. I think, Dominic, that's a really good point. But I think that, so I would feel that, okay, so I'll talk a little bit about my own experiences as well.
Yeah, please do. Especially the ones like you've almost implied now of being invited somewhere and you couldn't get to where you were supposed to. It sounded like a bit of an anecdote indirectly.
Well, yeah, look, I mean, that in my own life, as you can see, I have a disability, and lots of people have disabilities that are non-visible, and it can be a whole range of other challenges in relation to that. And maybe we come to that in a minute when we talk about online engagement, because I think so we'll come to that in a minute. But in terms of my own experience, my own experience was that I'm doing my PhD. I mean, Dominic, you met me when I was starting my PhD journey.
That's why I'm so impressed that you're so far, because I know these are the kind of things that, especially if one is involved in advocacy and everything, the PhD always takes the kind of the back burner. So really, really great that you're so far now.
Yeah, thanks, Dominic. Well, I'm actually, the advocacy has been a huge opportunity to bring what I am learning through my PhD to the policy table, and actually to have a direct influence on policy in Ireland. So it's been really useful. But one of the things, of course, I was quite ill during my PhD, so I was unwell, and for large periods of time I would be sick in hospital, and so I wouldn't be able to engage with my group, my research group in college, and so I really had to move myself online to enable me to engage, and it took some work, because a couple of years ago that wasn't the way we did things so much. We did it to a degree, so for instance, if I was wanting to arrange a meeting, I had to go to the college when I often wasn't well. And so technology now has, the last couple of months for me have been fantastic in terms, okay, let me just say, I didn't enjoy cocooning, but what it has been fantastic is that I have been able to have meetings like this today without me traveling 2 hours in the morning and 2 hours in the evening, which used up all of my very valuable energy resources, and sometimes resulted in becoming ill. So immediately it has created a huge benefit. And today, I spent most of today engaged in an online course in Trinity College Dublin for PhD students. Last year, that wasn't online, and I couldn't do it. So because I couldn't go to the college because I was in hospital this time last year. So I mean, I'm sitting going through it today, and I'm thinking, oh my God, I wish I knew that last year. So no, but yeah. So the point is that it does offer opportunities for people who are facing the wider societal barriers. And in terms of my work, I have actually been busier with paid employment in the last 6 months, 4 months, than I have been for the last year. Because why? Because lecturing moved online. It mean again, I didn't have all this traveling and the stress of trying to get into inaccessible buildings, and it meant I actually gained more employment. So it's very funny that the benefits that have accrued to me as a result of moving online, even though, as I said, cocooning has meant I've had to stay indoors. But hey,
I think yeah. No, go on, Sabrina, please.
No, but that's super interesting, because like with several guests here on Kiron Talks, we've been discussing like what happens after Corona, right? And what happens if you can go back offline. And we discussed a lot about like many people even want to, right? Because the digital move hasn't been as smooth as it could have been because you haven't done it before and all of that. But let's say if everyone moves back offline and the sessions are held there, like, do you think it's an option to simply, have an online version even in the classroom? Like, let's say the easiest way would be to just have a laptop open and then live stream it and have a proper mic on the professor, for example, to simply like keep that inclusivity and the opportunity alive? Or I don't know, like, would that be more inclusive maybe again, because it's
yeah, and I think that's a really interesting question. I know from my perspective that's what I would like to see. That's the option I would like to see, because I think that, well, if we just take, say, for in Australia, where they're often dealing with students in the outback, or a lot of mature students, or a lot of students who are working, they have really had to adapt their courses because they had very, very poor retention rates. And so they had to make that blend, they had to make that move to a blended learning approach, which mixed a mixture of in-class with online, in order to facilitate their students and actually increase their retention numbers. So they, in Australia, they have actually been working on that for quite some time, and in some parts of Asia as well, where the student profile is somewhat different, but also the environment in which the students are in. So it's not terribly unusual. It's a bit unusual for us, but not so much for them. But I think what we have to remember as well, though, that so we might see this as, giving disabled students increased access to higher education, but that does not necessarily mean increased accessibility in terms of content, in terms of learning activities, assessments, but also in social engagement. And I just want you to think for a moment and ask yourselves, okay, in terms of conferences, what are the reasons you go to a conference?
Well, to meet people.
Exactly, Tino. Exactly. Yes, to meet people. And wouldn't it be lovely today if us four were in a room and had a cup of tea, and could have that interaction, and could read each other, but sometimes that's not obviously possible in this case. So what I'm saying is that we need to think about the community aspect of online learning.
Well,
yeah, go ahead.
well. Let me. I
No,
was
Tino.
just thinking the whole time exactly about this, because I think it has two sides and it has positive sides and problems in it that go further than what we're talking about. So you said you have an access to certain learning contents and situations that you didn't have before. You didn't have to do this traveling. There's an advantage. You can meet more people than before. So on the other side, you say there's the community aspect that we need to keep in mind, because it's not only about content, but it's about who we are with. So I would like to ask you just a little bit broader opinion here. So what do you think change? Now there are progresses in developing the online tools for people to engage technically, remotely. So what do you think, including the disabled people and all of them, so everybody, what do you think, does this greater accessibility, this higher technical possibilities now, what do they change, and what are the dangers possibilities for the community here? What are your what is your opinion about this new change situation we're in?
Okay, so yeah, I think you've really, yeah, I think that's a very, very valid point. And I've highlighted the positives, but what are the negatives? There is a very, very significant negative that many in the disabled community are very worried about. And so I'm going to give you some context. When we talk about disability, there are kind of two main viewpoints, if you like. And there was this two main models. There are more, but the two main ones are the medical model and the social model. Right? In the medical model, it's the viewpoint where we see disabled people as the problem, that the problem is within them, that they need to be fixed. And in the social model, it is the second model. It's the viewpoint, well, actually, you know what? It's society that needs to be fixed. That, we can improve the infrastructure, we can improve the mindset. And if we improved all of those things, disabled people would be able to go about their viewpoint. The medical model very much focused on, institutionalizing disabled people, almost hiding them away. Where the social model is about disabled people getting out, interacting with people, being involved, being part of the community. So to answer your question, Tina, my biggest fear is, in actual fact, in some ways, what will happen is that because we're providing all these services online, disabled people will end up spending more time isolated at home, and we won't make the infrastructural changes in our society, and that needs to be made. And then let's think of the attitudinal changes. We all know from the research that in terms of diversity and inclusion, that if you know a Black person, or if you know a disabled person or a gay person, your attitudes to them are more likely to be positive. So if in your workforce, all the people who are able to go into the office, but the disabled people end up having to stay at home, your community won't get to interact with them. And I think that's a major fear that I have. I have that fear that that it may work for governments, institutions, and etc., not to provide the supports out in the community that they should be providing. So that's my biggest fear, actually. So yeah.
You see, Dominic, the change of the improvement of the technology doesn't imply necessarily an improvement of the social way of thinking, and this is exactly your the crucial point of what you're doing, isn't it?
Yeah. Go ahead, Dominic.
No, I agree.
No, well, but this is very crucial.
I mean, I totally agree with this point. I think it's great to hear it from you, Viv. It's just on a side note, in a way, at Kiron, we have always said that we're remote friendly for all our meetings. So we've always said for all our meetings, it doesn't matter if you can be physically in the meeting or not. we're always remote friendly. And that meant that you might have a meeting with 6 people in it, and one of those people was not there, they were online. So the 6 people, or that, let's say the 5 people, they'd be sitting in the room, they might start using post-it notes on the back wall, and the person online was not really part of this meeting. And what we have tried to do to be more remote friendly is if you have 1 or 2 people who can't be in the room, everybody has to, in a way, be in the same conditions. So it means that we try and move everything online then. And this is to your point of, it shouldn't become some kind of way of saying, okay, they're kind of in the room, we don't need to think about them anymore. It's about creating these inclusive environments. And the other point, which is part of that, is, and it's a point we've had basically on almost every single one of our now 12 Kiron talks, has always been, how can we create this kind of social interaction also when we're in an online environment? And I mean, Sabrina and I, we had a small chat the other day about why we think the Kiron talks itself is so nice. And we were saying, you're right, Viv, it would be super nice if we had the chance to all come to Dublin and have a cup of tea or maybe a beer with you. But that would be some kind of huge arrangement to do it. This is amazing that we can just capture you now, have a chat with you, and then afterwards we're going to have this as a podcast, etc., so other people can have this kind of interaction as well. It's not the same, but it's kind of moving in that direction, I think. But still, we all know there's something missing. And I would also be afraid, as you say, Viv, of this kind of thing of saying, okay, well, we don't have to deal with that group, because that group is a bit like my example now of the 1 person of the 6. We're like, they're there really, so it's fine. It's not a solution. And I think it is going to remain a challenge.
Yeah. I mean, just to throw another experience in there, maybe, I would also rather see it as a bridge, right? Because for me, it was always a challenge, during studies, I moved around a lot, right? And I was volunteering with a humanitarian organization and had a board position, and I didn't want to give it up, right? Just because I left my home southern German area. But it also meant I couldn't travel for 6 hours in a train to attend a 1.5-hour meeting and then travel back 6 hours, right? So for me, it's really also the opportunity that communities grow bigger than they otherwise would be, right? Because as you said before, if you have a few instances where you don't have the energy or the strength to travel, I mean, it doesn't mean that you don't travel ever to any lectures, but it helps you to make the bridge for the 1 or few or 3 or 4 occasions where you just can't, and you otherwise would miss out, right? So maybe that's a way also sessions need to be created and digitalization needs to be used.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think, look, we have to accept that there's a bit of catching up to be done here in terms of that. COVID happened, or the whole environment changed, and people had to move online, and that we had, look, people were being encouraged to do it and to work in that way, but now we need to actually start to, some time has passed now, so we need to actually sit down and look at what we're doing and say, okay, how can I do that differently? And to answer, and better, of course. And that, to come back to Dominic's point, I think a key part of that must be sitting down and saying, who's not in the room? Who is not in the room?
Yeah.
Who's partially in the room? So, and then asking that question. And then I think as well that what is going to happen as well, as I think, is that there's going to be a group of people who had been very successful in the other environment, who now may actually kind of fall off a little bit, and we need to start considering them as well. So I think actually one way of helping do all of this is using a technique or a model called universal design for learning. And so some of you, I mean, basically it's a set of principles for curriculum development that give all individuals equal opportunities to learn, including students with disabilities, right? And the ultimate aim is to improve the educational experience of all students, and that it caters for the diversity of learners, which are both within our classroom, but within our online environment. And it has been underpinned by research in the field of neuroscience and designed to improve the learning experience. But for ye and for your listeners, there is a framework for that, and that a simple one is like there are three main points, which are multiple means of engagement. So it's stimulating motivation and enthusiasm through that. Multiple means of representation, and that doesn't mean just the voice of learners, but actually means the different ways of presenting your information to the students. And I think, you know what, a key point to that is to remember, in the words of W.B. Yeats, that education is not the filling of a pail, but the lighting of a fire. So I think it's very important to remember that. And then the third one is multiple means of action, which, you know, ways of demonstrating learning. And so universal design for learning offers a static framework in which to work. And I think if we use that when we're bringing together our online presentations or online programs, then I think we would have a much more fair, diverse, equal learning method. And I think it's not difficult. Most of what some of us do already does that. We already tick those boxes, but it's just about taking a little bit of consideration. And what I would add to all of that is what we've mentioned so many times here today, is including the voice of disabled people. Yeah. And that, so in terms of my own experience, back to my own experience, as I said, I lecture in Trinity College Dublin, and I lecture in the Trinity Centre for people with intellectual disabilities. And obviously our modules all moved online as well. But what I did is I collaborated with my colleagues, and I'm really lucky that I work with very, very innovative colleagues who are really interested and committed, and that we looked at our module and we said, okay, that we looked at our learners, we looked at the environment, and we said, look, we're losing that connection that we had. How are we going to build that connection? Okay, it's the way we deliver won't suit the students. We need to deliver differently. And how are we going to improve engagement? How are we going to create that sense of belonging for the students within our class? So we very simply actually did some very, very simple techniques, like we split our class. We halved the time spent on online lectures. So for instance, instead of a 2-hour lecture, it became like a 50-minute lecture. That we had half the number of students in that group. And then we used multiple means of communication within it. So for instance, in the first, one of my colleagues, Jess Mannion, had a great idea of lip syncing as an icebreaker as soon as we started. Wonderful. And that was just fun, and it broke it up. Then we worked into maybe some more serious items. Then in the next time we used Zoom rooms to great effect. Then we might use some of the like Kahoot for the purposes of maybe quiz, and maybe we might do an online survey as well, as part of it. But what I'm saying is we use different techniques, and because I know that if it was me, I know after 20 minutes I'm bored. So I just need that, and we all do, I think.
I think that's such an important point for education. It's so often when we're designing educational environments, we don't put ourselves in them. So like you say, this kind of thing, you say, okay, if that was me, I'd be bored. This is the moment where you have to think, okay, well, maybe that learning environment is not perfect. And I mean, this is a bit of my hope, actually, in a way, that the kind of the COVID and us all being pushed into just having to rethink how we're organizing learning makes us maybe a bit more experimental and will help us kind of think of the different kinds of ways we can organize our learning and get really new ideas from it. So I think that's really good. And what we often do, if certain things are mentioned, then we try and link them afterwards also underneath the video. So we'll definitely do it with the universal design principles, because I also think they're super important. And I think, one of the biggest challenges remains of this many voices approach, as you mentioned, because it always seems that's a great idea when we talk about it in theory, and then we think, oh, how are we going to actually organize it in such a way? I imagine that's one reason why it's often not taken up. But I'm a bit wary of our time. I shall pass on to our moderator, Tino, for normally the big complicated question which he wants to always leave us with.
Well, no. That's in fact these principles you mentioned, you explained to us, Vivian, are actually pedagogical principles that teachers learn when they become teachers. I, as a German teacher, sometimes as a trainer for foreigners, I had to go through this to access all the different ways of learning: writing, hearing, seeing, speaking themselves, doing it with gestures, and then come another part that you mentioned. There are interaction elements that are the right ones for certain groups of people, if they are present in the room, if they are not good in the language, if they're maybe in another way disabled. And so a perspective that you bring, it creates awareness in itself. And I think the political question here is always the fight for good teachers and for their education and for their multiplication, certainly, and also the kind of content that you just mentioned. And so even Dominic, with his love for technology, fits in there, because these people who try to find the technical solutions for the questions we're talking about, they supply new questions and well, old questions in a new guise that we are working with to improve teaching and learning. And so to make maybe in this more digital and in this more virtual world we're going into now, as digital migrants, all we are, no? In this world, this new awareness of dealing with that is something that is growing now, and your PhD apparently is an important part of it. I would say maybe to close, before Dominic is announcing again this most important conference of Kiron tomorrow, maybe Vivian, you tell us what you think is the most important thing to keep in mind, and even Sabrina, and so we can finish up with Dominic announcing the Kiron conference tomorrow. What do you think, Vivian?
Tino, thank you very much. That it's always very difficult to identify one thing, but I think that in this case we'll finish with what we started with, which was you must keep the voice of disabled people in mind first. So the motto of the independent living movement is nothing about us without us. So include disabled people in the decision-making process in relation to online engagement in their learning, and they are best positioned to tell you what they want and need.
Yeah, it's super interesting. I just go ahead, right? Yeah.
Yes, Sabrina, we want to include women too, please.
Yeah, that's a perfect transition for my last comment I actually wanted to make. Because in our pre-chat, like we also discussed, like what's the one key thing, right? And for me, it's a user-centric design, right? And that doesn't matter only in digital products, but that's something that I learned while working at Kiron, right? And that I wasn't aware of before. Like really having the user at the center of anything you do. And one of the most like horrific things I read is that car seats, for example, are designed in a way that they cause more harm for women if they come into a car accident, because they're designed for a standardized male, height, weight, and whatever. And in the end, that's just horrible, right? And that's not a minority, because women are even 50% of the population, right? So in the end, for me, no matter if it's digital products or offline products, traditional ones, whatever, we need to move forward in having more the user in mind, and especially the diversity of the users, in order to really solve all those challenges.
Well, that's a perfect handing off the ball on to me, because there's something I've been very interested in. It's, if I remember rightly, it's called the jagged edge theory. And it was based on the idea that there was an idea in the past to build the perfect fighter plane, or in fact to get the seating exactly right for the fighter pilot in a fighter plane. And what they did is they tried to work out what are all the average dimensions of the fighter pilot. And what it led to is this seat was useless, because it wasn't useful for anyone, because they'd only focused on the average. And this is a perfect transition, not only to from Viv's main point, which is many voices, but also to the conference that we're going to have tomorrow on Friday the 19th and on Saturday the 20th. This whole week is World Refugee Week, and we are having, we've organized at Kiron an online conference which we're calling Amplify now. We have a kind of a warm-up session tomorrow, and then we have many sessions. If I remember rightly, it was well over 20 different sessions right across the world in multiple languages. And as much as possible, we have refugees and migrants who are actually leading the sessions or contributing to the sessions. So it's not Kiron doing something for these people, but we've been very keen to include these people and actually to co-create the conference with them. So we are really we see ourselves very much as moderating a conference which is coming up, which is really about this multiple voice. And we hope at Kiron that we be able to learn a lot from these 2 days, and we invite everyone to go to the website. I think if you just probably by now Google for Amplify Now, you will find us already. Otherwise, we are on virtualrefugeeconference.com, if I remember correctly. We're all over the social media at the moment, so it shouldn't be too difficult to find us. But please do join in these discussions. Discussions with other people are just so important to enable us to do good design. I think this is really, how we get forward. And so that would be my point. Please join us on Friday and Saturday. Tino.
Well, thank you everybody for being here tonight. I would say we close the session here. I'm a man, which is in a disability in itself, so I can have the last word. And so I wish everybody a nice evening, and thank you everybody for being here. It was cool. See you next week, hopefully.
Viv, thanks
Goodbye.
ever so much for being with us. It was a pleasure.